Hey everyone, this is a piece by Stephen Resnick and Richard Wolff titled State Capitalism in the USSR, a high-stakes debate. This piece is originally from 1993. Since day one of the Russian Revolution, supporters and critics have argued over its actual class structure. Some loved or hated the USSR on the agreed ground that it really was socialist and en route to communism. Others viewed it as a state capitalist class structure, more or less inevitably on the road to private capitalism. Some compared the USSR's class structure to fascism, a mix and merger of private and state capitalist enterprises. Intense passions, ideological commitments, and high practical stakes were attached to these heavily laden terms of a debate that has flared up recurringly since 1917. The debate, focused not most often on the term state capitalism, reflected and provoked some of the most important struggles over policy within the USSR, and many important struggles outside of the USSR as well. Of course, this debate was not only a matter of understanding the nature of Soviet society and its history, it was also about how to fashion a class analysis of any society. We think that the key issues of that debate are at stake again. As the former USSR is dismantled, how are we to account for that process, especially in class terms? Is it the, quote, collapse of communism, the, quote, end of socialism, and the inevitable transition from them to capitalism, as many claim? Or is it the case, claimed by others, that the USSR never did get beyond capitalism, or more specifically, state capitalism, and hence no socialism existed there from which a transition could occur? The focus here is to critically review the main lines of the debates to date over state capitalism in the USSR. The yield is a set of lessons drawn from the Soviet experiment of 1917 to 1990 that can be added to what Marx, Engels, and Lenin learned from the Paris Commune, and to what radicals have learned from the other revolutionary upsurges towards social justice and equality over the last century. Three lessons in particular are striking. First, within Marx's theory of exploitation, as the appropriation of surplus labor by non-producers, in parentheses, there is a case for characterizing Soviet industry as state capitalist in its class structure. We intend to make that case in a later paper. Second, that case is not the one actually argued by most Marxists and non-Marxists who have engaged the issue. Rather, most debaters on all sides failed either to construct or refute this case because their focus was overwhelmingly on matters of property and power rather than class exploitation. Third, and perhaps the most troubling lesson of all, the failure of public discourse about the USSR to debate exploitation contributed to enabling such a capitalist class structure to survive there. New section. Early conceptualizations of state capitalism. The term state capitalism has a long variegated history. The published overviews of major portions of that history, such as Jerome and Buick, 1967, Bettelheim, 1976, and Bellis, allow us here simply to summarize the basic alternative ways in which the term has been used. An early and long influential usage in Marxist circles occurred prior to 1917 in Austria and Germany. Marx defined state capital as existing when, quote, governments employ wage labor in mines, railways, etc., perform the function of industrial capitalists, end quote. Engels elaborated the point, quote, the transformation, of capitalist enterprises, into state ownership does not do away with the capitalistic nature of the productive forces, The modern state, again, is only the organization that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the general external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against the encroachments as well of the workers as of individual capitalists. The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine. The state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital, The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with. The capitalist relation is not done away with, end quote. Engels. When I repeat something, it means in italics, and it says the emphasis is added by Wolff and Resnick. Footnote. There's some footnotes that I missed, at least. Periodically, debate has shifted to focus on the related but different concept of state monopoly capitalism, which we do not discuss since our purposes here do not require attention to the differences between the two concepts. On state monopoly capitalism, see Fine and Harris, 1979, and Jessup, 1982, and footnote. Footnote. To avoid misunderstanding, we wish to stress that our questions and references are drawn to illustrate arguments and approaches that were important components in widespread discussions. We do not intend to attach particular individuals to particular positions, since the positions are our concern, and since most individuals took different and often opposite positions at different times, as in Lenin's example, which we do discuss because of the importance of his views in the debates. End footnote. All right. Marx's phrase, quote, performed the function of industrial capitalist, end quote, refers directly to his argument in Capital. The industrial capital is that particular kind of capital that expands that capital's value by appropriating the surplus labor of that capital's employees, by exploiting them. Footnote. We rely here on Marx's systematic distinction between industrial capital as opposed to merchants and money-lending capital. Whereas industrial capitalists exploit, appropriate the surplus labor of others, merchant and money-lending capitalists do not. Instead, merchant and money-lending capitalists obtain from the industrial capitalists certain distributed portions of the surplus already appropriated by the industrial capitalists. End footnote. Marx's point is that either private individuals or state officials or both may function as industrial capitalists. Engels' statement reinforces Marx's by insisting that the change in ownership of productive assets from private to state does not necessarily entail a change in the capitalist exploitative class structure of production. When it does not, state capitalism is just the substitution of state functionaries for private individuals in the roles of capitalist appropriators of surplus labor. Notwithstanding Marx's image in the generation before the Soviet Revolution, most Marxists developed and used a very different concept of state capitalism. They stressed the idea that the modern European state increasingly regulated, subsidized, and coordinated private enterprises in a qualitatively new phase of capitalism's development. This was occurring to such an extent that the state became part of the logic and momentum of capitalism itself. Writing in 1916, Karl Renner argued that Marx had not quite envisioned this result. Quote, organized national capital uses the state power precisely as a positive economic agency, ... The state deliberately assists in the concentration of capital, ... State power and the economy begin to merge, ... The war, ... has merely accelerated an already apparent line of development, ... One might say that laissez-faire capitalism has changed into state capitalism, ... Socialization, which Marx regarded as inevitable, has thus taken a course which was not to be foreseen. End quote. Karl Renner, the Austrian Marxist. Footnote. The quotation is taken from Renner's 1916 series of articles titled Probleme des Marxismus, published in Der Kampf and translated in Baltimore and Good, 1978. End footnote. The role of the state as itself an industrial capitalist was de-emphasized. State capitalism instead meant increasingly comprehensive state intervention in and control over private capitalist enterprises, with or without actual state industrial production. Other Austrian Marxists such as Rudolf Hilferding, Max Adler, and Otto Bauer, and German Marxists such as Karl Kautsky articulated similar arguments stressing the immense social significance of state capitalism in this sense of state control over private capitalists in the new stage of capitalism's development. Footnote. A summary and bibliography of the Austrian views are available in Baltimore's Introduction to Baltimore and Good, 1978. Kautsky's position developed earlier, 1910. End footnote. Lenin drew on these theories for his imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and for his post-revolutionary arguments explaining the need for a state capitalist phase in the USSR. It was these early Marxist theorists of state capitalism as state control, rather than the different concepts of Marx and Engels stressing state appropriation of surplus labor, that influenced thinking and policies in the USSR, both directly and indirectly via the intense debates over the relationship between the state and socialist revolution. One side in those debates tended to the view that state capitalism, as the epitome of rational coordination of production, distribution, and accumulation, represented the final preparation for a transition to socialism. It was the ultimate socialization of the forces of production achievable within the shell of capitalist relations of production. This side could quote Engels to the effect that the capitalist relation had been brought to its historical finale in state capitalism, and that, quote, concealed within it, bracket, state capitalism, and bracket, are the technical conditions that form the elements, end quote, of a transition to socialism. The next historical step, enabled by state capitalism and provoked by state capitalism's contradictions, would have to be the socialist revolution. By abolishing private property and all its attendant institutions, the revolution would take over this state capitalism and, in the workers' interest, transform it into socialism. Bukharin systematically elaborated this argument in various forms. Footnote. Bukharin returned repeatedly in his writings to theorizations of state capitalism, clearly derived from the Austro-Marxist Kautsky et al. Its relation to socialism, state capitalism's relation to socialism, and Bukharin's disagreements with Lenin on this issue, since he, more than Lenin, believed the USSR had gone beyond state capitalism to socialism. C. Cohen, it's probably Stephen F. Cohen, 1980. End footnote. Production would then soar, free to the fetters of private profitability, business cycles, and so on, and the socialist future would unfold as poverty, exploitation, and oppression disappeared. The other side in the debate over state capitalism expressed deep suspicions about, quote, taking over state capitalism in the context of a stages approach to the socialist transformation. For these critics, socialism required, and the socialist revolution meant, the fundamental destruction of both capitalist relations of production and the capitalist state. The abolition of private property was hardly enough to secure transition to socialism. A radical break and something radically new, in terms of both productive enterprise and the state, were necessary. Footnote. Thus Lenin stressed that a socialist state was sensible only insofar as a struggle against capitalism remained necessary after the revolution. Only when capitalism was finally defeated, would socialism have no more need of a state. It could and would only then wither away into a kind of communal administration. End footnote. As we shall show, this side came to focus its attention on the issue of a radical break in power relations, the issue of just exactly who controlled enterprise and state in the USSR. This debate left a legacy of division over assessments of and proposals for development inside the USSR. One set of critics of Soviet development argued that state capitalism had not been surpassed in the USSR. Instead of completing the passage from capitalism to socialism, the revolution had been aborted as at the middle stage. The USSR was actually a state capitalism. Despite the abolition of private property, ultimate power congealed in an apparatus composed of the Communist Party and a state bureaucracy. No radical break in the power of a few over the many had been achieved. Worse still, by stressing the commanding role of the Communist Party, defined as the vanguard representative of all Soviet workers, state capitalism masqueraded as socialism. Thus, in the view of the leading Marxist Menshevik, Martov, Soviet workers were suffering all the hardships and injustices associated with capitalism, generally within a concentrated state capitalism in a backward society. Footnote. Martov repeatedly used the term state capitalism in his polemics against the Bolsheviks after the revolution. See the careful discussion on just this dimension of Martov's work in Burbank in 1886. End footnote. Early defenders of the Soviet Union's development path, including Lenin, despite Lenin's earlier position, used the term state capitalism much more positively. In a manner reminiscent of Engels' remark, they saw Soviet state capitalism as a necessary stage between the overthrow of capitalism and the achievement of socialism, not to speak of communism. In Lenin's view, the unforeseeable twists and turns of social and political conditions returned the Soviet leadership periodically and always conditionally to a reliance on a controlled, quote, state capitalism as a means toward their socialist ends. Quote, the workers, are advancing toward socialism precisely through the capitalist management of trust, through gigantic machine industry, through enterprises which have a turnover of several millions per year, only through such a system of production in such enterprises. The workers are not petty bourgeois. They are not afraid of large-scale, quote, state capitalism. They prize it as their proletarian weapon, which their Soviet power will use. End quote, Lenin. Footnote. Left-wing childishness and the petty bourgeois mentality, published in Pravda, May 1918, and reprinted in Lenin. Bettelheim documents Lenin's shifts of strategic position in regard to state capitalism. End footnote. In effect, Lenin was arguing that state capitalism, if under the control of workers committed to the transition to socialism, was an acceptable as well as necessary stage for the USSR to pass through. The transition was secure so long as Soviet power was. In the years after Lenin's death in 1923, the term state capitalism was less and less used by defenders of the USSR as a descriptive or analytic term for state industry. Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, I think Lenin died in 1924. I had to look that up real quick. In the years after Lenin's death in 1923, it's actually 1924, the term state capitalism was less and less used by defenders of the USSR as a descriptive or analytic term for state industry. Defenders of the USSR used the term socialism instead. Having abolished private property and the means of production and replaced markets with state planning, the USSR had thereby eliminated capitalist exploitation and classes altogether, at least so far as state industrial production was concerned. There thus remained no need to undertake class analyses of Soviet industry, since their ostensible object had vanished. Ironically, Marxist defenders of the USSR now share a basic theoretical precept with anti-Marxist critics. Neither use class analysis in their arguments. The defenders' reasons for banishing class analysis in this way included the undesirable and uncomfortable connotations of phrases like state capitalism or class structure within descriptions of Soviet state industry. They desired to distance themselves from and to counter-attack the critics who used the term in the increasingly hostile debates. The defenders' theoretical approach to the notion of state capitalism thus became one of systematic and intense rejection. State capitalism evolved then as an idea, or rather as a set of diverse conceptions used chiefly to criticize and attack the development path and leadership of the USSR for betraying the goals of the 1917 revolution. However, the contested conceptions of state capitalism have a greater importance than their role in partisan debates. They constitute the only sustained class analysis undertaken of Soviet industry since 1917. New section, Conflicting Conceptions of State Capitalism. However suggestive and influential in terms of provoking research, controversies, or strategic rethinking, the different meanings attached to them to the term state capitalism were usually quite vague, general, and abstract. Barry Hindis has argued that this reflected the related imprecision in existing definitions of socialism and communism. Wikipedia says Barry Hindis lived from 1939 to 2018 and was an emeritus professor in the School of Social Sciences at Australian National University. Barry Hindis was for many years an academic sociologist in the UK, mainly at the University of Liverpool, and has published widely on social and political theory and on the history of political thought. Barry Hindis was one of the editors of Theoretical Practice, which in the 1970s critically examined the structural Marxism of Louis Althusser, with other editors such as his former pupil, Paul Hurst, Tony Cutler, and Attar Hussain. This interrogation eventually undermined their original support for Althusser. One of Hindis's doctoral students is Maria Barg, professor of politics and Maori studies at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Hindis held a BA from Oxford University and a MA and PhD from University of Liverpool. Barry Hindis was elected Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia in the political science discipline in 1995. Back to the text. And Barry Hindis says, quote, "The absence of a rigorous definition of the socialist mode of appropriation of surplus labor means that the domination of socialist relations of production tends to be identified with specific forms of domination of the workers over the means of production. ... In the case of the system of state enterprises, ... The dominance of socialist relations is identical with certain specific forms of the domination of workers with respect to the political apparatus of the state. Thus, an economic relation is conflated with what are thought to be its political conditions of existence. Thus, an economic relation is conflated with what are thought to be that economic relation's political conditions of existence." End quote. Barry Hindis. In some arguments, state capitalism refers to property ownership, to a situation in which the state owns the means of production, yet leases such means to private capitalists. In several speeches from 1921 to 1923, Lenin used the term in that sense, as Stalin did also in 1925. Footnote: Stalin's use was more restrictive. It was only leases of state productive property to foreign concessionaires that constituted state capitalism. See Bettelheim, 1978, end footnote. Lenin explained that the strategic retreat represented by the New Economic Policy, NEP, required allowing such leasing to private capitalists along with allowing private capitalists to use their own productive assets. This was a political necessity dictated by the circumstances. However, he argued, since the proletariat and not the capitalists controlled the state, the transition to socialism remained securely on course. Indeed, the capitalist enterprises would enlarge the ranks of the proletariat, thus also contributing to the transition. Footnote: Many of Lenin's and others' references presumed that such private capitalist enterprises would be overwhelmingly small scale, as in Lenin's instructions of the Council of Labor and Defense to local Soviet bodies. Quote, "The worker state has enough resources to keep within the proper bounds, and control these relationships which are useful and necessary in conditions of small-scale production." End quote. Lenin. However, as developed below in other contexts, Lenin applied the term capitalist to large, state-owned and operated enterprises as well. End footnote. In such formulations, where state capitalism referred to state-owned productive assets leased to private capitalists, the term socialism took on a special meaning. It referred to state-owned means of production that were not leased to private capitalists, but rather used directly in production in state enterprises. Thus, Lenin divided the Soviet economy in 1918 into 5 groups: patriarchal, (the most primitive forms of agriculture), small commodity producers, (the majority of peasants who traded in grain), private capitalism, state capitalism, and socialism. However, at other moments, under different and rapidly changing configurations of domestic and foreign pressures, Lenin, parenthesis, and of course others, end parenthesis, articulated a very different vision of state capitalism and state capitalism's relation to socialism. In this vision, the adjective capitalist, not socialist, was used to refer to large state-owned and state-run enterprises. Moreover, these state enterprises were known and expected to retain for some time their pre-revolutionary power configurations, their, quote, capitalist hierarchy of authority and wage levels, ... the capitalist forms of organization and the overall management, ... and the participation of capitalist and bourgeois technicians in these forms of organization, end quote. Bettelheim, 1976a. In 1917, Lenin wrote, quote, in a truly revolutionary democratic state monopoly capitalism inevitably and unavoidably means progress towards socialism, end quote. As we quoted Lenin earlier, workers in the USSR not only understood the absolute need for state capitalism, but also, quote, are not afraid of large-scale state capitalism, end quote. They had no need to fear such state capitalism because of the reality of Soviet state power overseeing and controlling it. That state power was determined, in Lenin's words, to, quote, hedge it out with conditions to ensure its transformation into socialism in the near future, end quote. See Bettelheim, 1976. In Trotsky's words, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat is expressed in the abolition of private property in the means of production, in the supremacy over the whole Soviet mechanism of the collective will of the workers, and not at all in the form in which individual economic enterprises are administered. Footnote. This passage, end quote. Trotsky. This, end quote, Trotsky. Footnote. This passage appears in Trotsky's 1920 Terrorism and Communism, which focused on an attack against Karl Kautsky's book with the same title published a year earlier in Germany. Indeed, the two books exemplify the different perspectives on state capitalism discussed in the text. In the ABC of Communism, Bukharin and Preobrazhensky identify state capitalism as the kind of state-coordinated capitalism in which the, quote, bourgeois dictatorship attains its climax, end quote, while socialism is the utterly different situation when the state is in the hands of the proletariat, end footnote. In such formulations, a remarkable development of Soviet thinking occurs. On one hand, it is affirmed that industrial enterprises owned and operated by the state can nonetheless be capitalist, and that the internal organizational structures of those enterprises can likewise replicate those of private capitalists. On the other hand, industrial functioning in these ways becomes socialist if it is subject to the power of a uniquely proletarian, that is, anti-capitalist and pro-communist, state. In this framework, state capitalism and socialism have virtually identical functioning productive enterprises. What distinguishes the two systems is not their production processes, but rather who controls these enterprises, and hence towards what ends that control is directed. As Lenin remarked, quote, socialism is nothing but state capitalist monopoly made to benefit the whole people. By this token, it ceases to be capitalist monopoly, end quote. Perhaps most significantly in terms of the subsequent debates over state capitalism and socialism in the USSR, the formulations of Lenin and Trotsky helped to place questions of power. Who controls or manages the economy, labor processes, wage levels, etc., and who sets basic policy goals? At the center of the controversy, the distribution of final power over enterprises, not the existence of expropriation and exploitation within their productive structures, became the determinant of socialism versus capitalism. This line of reasoning is particularly clear in the work of Trotsky, whose power focus led him to oppose the concept of state capitalism as inapplicable in the USSR. Trotsky views the substitution of state or private ownership of means of production, state rather than private control of enterprises, as absolutely incompatible with capitalism. Thus, if and when such substitution is attempted, private capitalists necessarily and always keep it strictly limited to maintain their control. For them, a move from limited to full state capitalism would risk the loss of their control. Such state capitalism would be, quote, too tempting an object for social revolution, end quote. From this, it follows for Trotsky that the USSR's total expropriation of private capital, precisely because it was not limited and did provide private capitalists of their former control, renders the term state capitalism inappropriate and misleading for the USSR. Footnote. Of course, such a focus on property is itself one kind of power theory. Property is a matter of power and its distribution, a matter of who controls, who has the power to deny others, access to objects. This illuminates why theorists who stress property in defining and analyzing socialism could and did shift later to focus on other kinds of power, who controls behavior other than access to objects, Such shifts were internal to a general theoretical orientation that placed power distributions, rather than exploitative or cultural or other aspects of society, at the center of attention as explanatory keys. End footnote. Instead of state capitalism, it is the Soviet bureaucracy's political misdeeds that have distorted the achievements of 1917 and suspended the transition to socialism. It is that bureaucracy's operations that risk an eventual regression to capitalism, but that would necessarily be a private capitalism. Footnote. Trotsky's words, written in the mid-1930s, have a distinctively contemporary ring as he foresees how the bureaucracy's abuses of power could produce a collapse eventuating in a return to necessarily private capitalism. Quote, a collapse of the Soviet regime would lead inevitably to the collapse of the planned economy and thus to the abolition of state property. The bond of compulsion between trusts and the factories within them would fall away. The more successful enterprises would succeed in coming out on the road of independence. They might convert themselves into stock companies, or they might find some other transitional form of property. One, for example, in which the workers should participate in the profits. The collective farms would disintegrate at the same time and far more easily. The fall of the present bureaucratic dictatorship, if it were not replaced by a new socialist power, would thus mean a return to capitalist relations with a catastrophic decline of industry and culture, end quote. Trotsky. End footnote. Trotsky thus defines capitalism in terms of private property ownership, dismissing the notion of state capitalism as irrelevant to the USSR. Trotsky concludes by focusing his entire analytical attention on the distribution of power inside the USSR as the key variable determining the USSR's future. Thus, albeit in different ways, both Trotsky's writings and those of Lenin served as a kind of theoretical bridge that shifted discussion of the USSR, including its class structure, from a focus on exploitation or property to one on power. As we shall see, for many of those influenced by Lenin and Trotsky, this opened the path to designating the USSR as state capitalists not on the basis of exploitation or property ownership, an unacceptable sort of argument for them, but rather on the basis of the distribution of power. Footnote. Very similar influences may be seen to have operated also on those who did not build their analyses of the USSR explicitly around the notion of state capitalism. We may cite one influential example, Bruno Ricci, who articulated in 1939 the notion of the USSR as a new type of class society, neither capitalist nor socialist, in which he argued the bureaucracy is the dominant class. Interestingly, however, while defining class in terms of power, a quote, bureaucratic class, Ricci also seeks to connect his power concept of class back to a Marxist concern with exploitation by referring to the bureaucracy as, quote, exploiting proletarians, end quote, although without systematic elaboration or exploration of what this might mean. End footnote. The following sorts of questions became central. Will Soviet workers whose power over labor is remuneration, will Soviet workers whose power over labor, its remuneration, and its surpluses are subordinated to industrial enterprises, be nonetheless ultimately dominant via their control of the state, or groups other than workers, state bureaucrats, party officials, and so on, come to control the state against such workers' interests. How is it the actual history of the USSR since 1917? How is the actual history of the USSR since 1917 to be understood in terms of such a power conflict? The focus on power has been the major interest of most writers on state capitalism. The particular conditions that provoked Lenin's changing formulations, and those of his opponents, faded with memory, leaving the formulations themselves for subsequent debaters to develop. Thus, the issue of workers' power in industry and their power in the state have taken center stage in the ongoing struggles to define and situate state capitalism and its relationship to socialism in the USSR. One large group of arguments advances variations on the theme that socialism, or the project to create socialism, was defeated in a power struggle between workers and capitalists or agents of capitalists. Capitalism triumphed in the form of state enterprises which, while thoroughly capitalist, were disguised as, quote, socialism to provide ideological cover in the face of Soviet workers' expectations and aspirations. Thus, for example, Dunayevskaya argues that there were two antagonistic planning principles struggling for dominance in the USSR, the workers' plan and the capitalist plan. The latter, the capitalist plan, focused on expanding means of production rather than means of consumption, on keeping workers' wages to a minimum, and on maximum surplus value and capital accumulation, or maximizing surplus value and capital accumulation, prevailed. Stalin and his successors, betraying the revolution, merely substituted a fetishism of capitalist and planning for the fetishism of commodities that characterized private capitalism. They thereby imposed and developed state capitalism in the USSR rather than socialism. In similar arguments, the International Socialism or Barbarism group, I don't think the Socialism or Barbarism group was actually international. It's pretty highly located in France, wrote, quote, the means of production will never be genuinely collective property as long as the workers, do not directly and totally manage production, determining both its methods and its objectives, end quote. Bellis, 1979. Written in the 1950s and 1960s, respectively, Dunayevskaya's and Socialism or Barbarism argument echo the much earlier statements of the, quote, left communists in 1918. Quote, we stand for the construction of the proletarian society by the class creativity of the workers themselves, not by the ukases, decrees, of the captains of industry, Socialism and socialist organization will not be set up by the proletariat itself, or they will not be set up at all. Something else will step up, state capitalism, end quote. It says Brinton 1970, but I don't know who is being referred to here. Because Maurice Brinton was not one of the original left communists of 1918. And then another quote says, quote, there can be no talk of, quote, state capitalism under the dictatorship of the proletariat, State capitalism presupposes the capitalist state, end quote. Dobb, 1966. Maurice Dobb certainly was not a left communist. The issue here is power, understood in strictly bipolar terms. Either the workers will control production at the workplace or else non-workers will. In the latter case, capitalist power will prevail. Hence capitalism, notwithstanding the formal ownership of means of production by society as a whole. In Bettelheim's careful articulations concerning Soviet state enterprises, Bettelheim decomposes the notion of property into the elements of, quote, separation and, quote, possession. Bettelheim finds that those enterprises involve a, quote, separation of workers from their means of production, parenthesis, which has as its counterpart the possession of these means by the enterprises, that is, in fact, by their managers, end quote. Bettelheim, 1975. Together with the separation of enterprises from one another, this effective possession by managers of nominally nationalized productive property comprises, for Bettelheim, quote, the central characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, end quote. Not formal property relations, but rather actual power distribution in production define capitalism. Bettelheim concludes, quote, in transitional formations, when the agents who are bearers of state property have acquired an autonomy in relation to the immediate producers, they form a state bourgeoisie, and the different powers that correspond to this property can be dissociated among different categories of agents, directors of enterprises, directors of trusts, managers of economic administrative bodies, managers of ministries, planning agencies, etc., end quote. Bettelheim. Beside Bettelheim, other interpreters of Mao's critiques of the USSR, parenthesis, as taking a, quote, capitalist rather than socialist road, end quote, end parenthesis, have also argued that socialist construction was hampered and undermined in favor of capitalist development in the USSR because of its distribution of power. Quote, the communist revolution is not a struggle for control of the same political edifice, but a struggle to replace one form of power, parenthesis, exploitative and oppressive, end parenthesis, by another, parenthesis, popular and emancipatory, end parenthesis. The same internal relations, in short, obtained between popular forms and socialist production, as whole between state forms and production grounded in appropriation of other people's labor, end quote. Parenthesis, Corrigan, Ramsey, and Say. I was curious myself, because I think that Sayer might be Derek Sayer. He wrote a very good book called The Violence of Abstraction, and I wonder what his political trajectory was, because I think I'm not sure what book this is, but it's something attached to Mao, some kind of Maoism. But I would say that a lot of his, I don't know, I'm just curious about what his political trajectory is, because in his later books he doesn't talk about Maoism at all as a reference point. So that's interesting. Another focus upon power in discussions of state capitalism takes the form of criticisms of hierarchy in production. Hierarchy itself is seen as power over workers and hence capitalist. The alternative, power wielded by workers, is seen as socialist or communist. Thus, C.L.R. James writes about the USSR that, quote, in state capitalism, the state becomes capitalistic in the sense of administration, supervision, control against the proletariat, end quote. C.L.R. James. And about Yugoslavia, that it follows, quote, the administrative plan of Stalinist Russia, bracket, and thus, in bracket, consciously organizes production according to the principle of the hierarchy in production, which, as we have explained, Marx analyzes the heart of capitalist authority. End quote. C.L.R. James. Tony Cliff extends the discussion of hierarchy to Soviet society as a whole, critically situating the party/state bureaucracy in the dominant power position, quote, the bureaucracy transformed into a personification of capital, for whom the accumulation of capital is the be-all and end-all here, must rid itself of all remnants of workers' control, must substitute conviction in the labor process by coercion, must atomize the working class, must force all social political life into a totalitarian mold, end quote. Tony Cliff, 1974. Individuals identified with the Frankfurt School of German Marxism also developed concepts of state capitalism that were sometimes applied to the USSR. Footnote. This application has been noted by several students of the Frankfurt School, including Jay and Arato and Gebhardt. End footnote. Although he explicitly rejects the concept's applicability to the USSR, Friedrich Pollock authored the most systematic discussion of state capitalism. For him, state capitalism was the logical next step for capitalism's private market phase, after capitalism's private market phase had developed into its monopoly phase. The model was Nazi Germany, although his argument allowed for the possibility of, quote, democratic as well as, quote, totalitarian forms of state capitalism. Pollock understood state capitalism to have left industrial property in private hands but under more or less total state control. The market was replaced by state command, parenthesis, possibly including administered markets and prices, as the method of distributing all resources, including labor power and all products. Profit, although private, were everywhere, where everyone subordinated to the state's plans for full employment, target levels of consumption and expansion. While not agreeing with the notion of state capitalism as Pollock defined it, his fellow Frankfurt School theorist Otto Kirchheimer summarized his similar sense of Nazi Germany in 1941 as, quote, preserving the institution of private property, whilst abolishing the correlative to private property, the freedom of contract, end quote. In contrast, Max Horkheimer took Pollock and Kirchheimer's ideas another important step in suggesting the applicability of the state capitalism concept to the USSR. Horkheimer distinguished fascism as state capitalism with private property but without markets from, quote, integral statism or, quote, state socialism in terms of the latter's abolition of private capitalists. Both systems were variant forms of the, quote, authoritarian state. Both were definitely Both systems were variant forms. I gotta restart that. Something came up on my screen. Horkheimer distinguished fascism as state capitalism with private property but without markets from, quote, integral statism or, quote, state socialism in terms of the latter's abolition of private capitalists. Both systems were variant forms of the, quote, authoritarian state. Both were definitely capitalist in the sense that in both the producers remained, quote, wage workers, proletarians, end quote. In both, surplus value, quote, is still the focal point, end quote. In state socialism, quote, factory regimentation is extended to the entire society, end quote. Footnote. Horkheimer understood the implications of his extension of the term state capitalist to the USSR. Quote, state capitalism sometimes seems almost like a parody of the classless society, end quote. Horkheimer. The Frankfurt School's usage of the term state capitalism to understand the USSR resembles other usages in its rejection of an equation of central planning and collective or state property ownership with socialism properly conceived. It also resembles them in its insistence that socialism had to do with the achievement of power by the producers, the antithesis of what defined the authoritarian state in either of its state capitalist forms, the fascist or the Bolshevik. Pollock drew out the logical implications of the argument. The displacement of private capitalism by state capitalism, quote, signifies the transition from a predominantly economic to an essentially political era, end quote. Pollock. That is, with state capitalism, political economy must give way to politics or political sociology as the science needed by socialists to criticize social reality. The, quote, profit motive is superseded by the power motive, end quote. Pollock. Power had become the central issue and thus the conceptual lens or framework through which to demonstrate how and why the USSR exhibited not socialism, but actually a virulent form of capitalism. Accepting the very rare and extremely brief mentions of surplus value, accepting the very rare and extremely brief mentions of surplus value and related economic concepts, parenthesis, such as Horkheimer's cited above, in parenthesis, it was the distribution of power that Frankfurt School thinkers analyzed to determine that the USSR was state capitalist. Indeed, the USSR was the ultimate state capitalism, having removed not only distribution from the market to the state, but also property, and having thereby empowered the state to completely regiment all social life. Earlier capitalisms had dreamed of such power, but had found it impossible to achieve. The Frankfurt School's theory was, then, also a power theory. It built up its social analysis on the basis of an assessment of the distribution of powers within the economic, cultural, and political spheres of the societies it chose to examine. Its assessment of the USSR as state capitalist was not based upon an analysis of the production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus labor, nor was it based on the difference between private and state or collectivized property. Writing more recently about Poland, Kuron and Modzelewski's famous manifesto, which is on this channel, offers yet another variant of the power argument. Quote, state ownership of the means of production is only a property form. The property belongs to the social groups controlling the state, ... One party has a monopoly, ... As in any hierarchical apparatus, commands issue from an elite, ... As the wielder of state power, this hierarchy has the nationalized means of production at its disposal, ... There, surplus product is taken away from them, the workers, by force. They have no control over the amount or how it is allocated and used for ends which are not alien and even inimical to them. Therefore, they are exploited, end quote. Kuron and Modzelewski. This quotation is noteworthy for its inclusion of property distribution, power distribution, and the production of surplus labor as three distinct bases for its conclusion regarding Poland's class structure. These authors' preferred term is a, quote, bureaucratic class system, end quote, but the referent here is not significantly different from what others call state capitalism. While property and surplus are mentioned, however, the focus and intensity of the argument concern the unequal distribution of power, quote, control over property, the surplus, and over virtually everything else in Poland. Unequal power positions are the cause. The bureaucratic class system, or state capitalism, not real socialism, is the result. Finally, Paul Maddox centralizes attention on power at both the general level of its social distribution and at what Maddox sees as its concrete results in the distribution of products of labor. Maddox thus argues that, quote, though private ownership no longer exists, the means of production still have the character of capital because they are controlled by government instead of being at the disposal of the whole country, end quote. Quote, the state capitalist system may be regarded as Keynesianism in Keynesianism's most consistent and most developed form, ... in the projected wider sense of a, quote, comprehensive socialization of investments, end quote. End quote. Maddox. Quote, the exploitation of men by men continues by way of an unequal system of distribution in both the conditions of production and the conditions of consumption. This inequality perpetuates competition as a struggle for the more lucrative positions and better paid jobs and carries the antagonisms of capitalism into the state capitalist system, end quote. Maddox. Especially worthy of note here is the transition in Maddox from the unequal distribution of social power, quote, over means of production, end quote, as the cause of a state capitalist system, to the unequal distribution of incomes and, more importantly, of bureaucratic status positions as that system's result. It thus follows that one can read back to a state capitalist economy from the empirical evidence of such unequal distributions. Thus, Maddox formalizes the logic implicit in so many statements of the state capitalist nature of the USSR across the last 75 years, scholarly, journalistic, artistic, and so on. They infer that nature from the empirical existence of unequal bureaucratic status positions. It is thus the distribution of power that determines in the last instance the capitalist versus the socialist class structure of a society. All the conceptualizations of the USSR as state capitalism viewed here share certain basic features. The Soviet nationalization of productive property, or at least the, quote, commanding heights, end quote, of its industry, is seen to have failed to erase its basic capitalist class nature. This view severs the logical correlation between the absence of private property in the means of production and the absence of capitalism. The USSR's elimination in the former did not eliminate the latter. The USSR's elimination of private property in the means of production did not eliminate capitalism. In these conceptualizations, analytical focus shifts from property to power. Despite this common basis, writers diverge in how they elaborate their arguments. Some, as we have noted, focus on how unequal distributions of power over the state, i.e. workers denied effective control over the state by its bureaucracy or by the Communist Party or both, reintroduce the separation of workers from the now nationalized means of production. This reestablishes capitalism in a state capitalist rather than in the previous private form. Others center attention on the productive enterprises. They stress the workers' lack of decision-making power and or management over production as reproducing the typical capitalist enterprise hierarchy, and hence, given state ownership, a state capitalist system. Still others stress the general social inequalities of income and authority as direct effects of capitalist class relations, that is, workers' lack of power over enterprise or state. Most conceptions of state capitalism thus refer to the distribution of power in society. Because that distribution in the USSR, and in other societies based on nationalized state enterprises, resembles the distribution found in societies based on private capitalist enterprises, the conclusion is drawn that the term, quote, socialist is a more or less unacceptable misnomer for state capitalism. Not surprisingly, the arguments of those who see the USSR as socialist instead of capitalist, have tended to make the term socialist strictly a matter of state ownership, usually linked to planning rather than markets, versus private ownership, usually linked to markets rather than planning, Certainly, some defenders of the USSR as socialist have also advanced power arguments. That power is, in fact, in workers, or their representatives, hands. However, the difficulties, not to speak of the derision, encountered by such arguments have helped to define the terrain of the debate as property theory defenders of the USSR as socialist versus power theory critics who call it state capitalist. The prevalence of power theories among all critics may be underscored by noting their influence as well among those hostile towards socialism and toward the USSR because of what they accept as its socialist nature. For them, socialism equals concentrated state power, state ownership, central planning, one-party monopoly, arrayed against and oppressive of private enterprise and the individual citizen. Predictably, many socialists stung by such a depiction of socialism have replied by seeking to define and elaborate concepts of socialism in which state power is decentralized and individual rights enhanced. In effect, a kind of socialism is proclaimed and advocated whose distribution of power would be immune to the power critique. The debates among such socialists usually revolve around concepts of, quote, democracy, as the desired and properly socialist distribution of power among citizens, enterprises, and the state. Then, a democratic socialism may be distinguished from centralized socialism, and so on. Footnote. One developed line of such reasoning with special application to productive enterprises is found in the work of Jaroslav Venec, or Jaroslav Venec. I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. 1975, and his associates. End footnote. The same power considerations even underlie the arguments of many who reject the USSR as either capitalist or socialist. Rudolf Hilferding, for example, uses a power argument to denounce any notion of the USSR as capitalist because of the state's power to allocate resources and products, that is, the absence of a market. Quote, the decisive symptom of the capitalist system of production, end quote. 1950. I should have that piece on this channel soon. It's called State Capitalism or Totalitarian Economy or something like that. Totalitarian State Economy? I'm not sure. Only if allocated power is in private hands and market mediated does capitalism exist. At the same time, The USSR is not socialist for Hilferding because of the USSR's, quote, unrestricted absolutism, end quote. Hilferding thus coins one of the many similar terms used by theorists who reject both capitalism and socialism as appropriate labels: totalitarian state economy. In this frankly essentialist formulation, power is the defining and governing essence of the economic and social system. For Hilferding, quote, politics, i.e. the state, plays a determining and decisive role, end quote. New section. The weaknesses of power theories of state capitalism. There are serious weaknesses in the power theories of state capitalism that have been applied to the USSR. The first concerns the issue of power and power's social distribution among individuals. Not only is it notoriously difficult to determine such distributions quantitatively, but the determinations actually made have been equally notoriously unsustainable when subject to criticism. For example, the conventional wisdom holds that under Lenin's new economic policy, the Soviet state dominated the private capitalist producers and independent merchants scattered across the countryside, at least in its early years. Yet close inspection yields a much murkier picture of who held much power, in which domains under the set of conditions: netmen, local, regional, and central authorities, and finally different state agencies at all levels. The same dissolution of simplistic notions of the distribution of power has emerged in recent years as a revisionist literature has focused on Stalin's first 5-year plan for industrialization and his collectivization of agriculture. The prevalent idea that Stalin wielded virtually a total monopoly of power had held these developments to be simply Stalin's, quote, revolution from above, end quote. The recent literature has demonstrated that there was also a complex revolution, quote, from below, end quote, in the precise sense of all sorts of powers wielded by diverse groups of workers, intellectuals, and others, powers with which Stalin had to contend and compromise. See Fitzpatrick, Cohen, Chase, Viola, Kuramiya, 1988. In this context, one might also mention the contemporary transformations of the USSR and all Eastern European countries. They strongly suggest that the distribution of power in these societies were far more diverse, complex, and contradictory than the simplistic images of central omnipotent state versus powerless masses that had dominated the prevalent power theorizations of those societies. For example, the entire history of Poland's communist government testifies to the many social groupings wielding all sorts of power, separate from and often hostile to communist state power and to one another. The Roman Catholic Church, ship workers, and eventually the Solidarity Organization were prominent among such groupings. Even after the state imposed martial law on the 13th of December 1981, partly to cope with the effects of their power, it still confronted all sorts of power-wielding groups, such as the Church, the formerly dissolved but still active Solidarity, underground, the Association of Polish Journalists, and the Union of Polish Writers, as well as the newly organized People's Universities and the Council of National Education. See Kamiński, 1991. By 1989, the Polish government, quote, had to reconcile itself with considerable political pluralism, end quote, Kamiński, within a transition to a non-communist government. To take yet another example, relevant to nearly all the East European countries, national and ethnic conflicts that are now intense have forced the recognition that national and ethnic groups had wielded effective power there for a long time. The image of central authorities unaffected by national and ethnic power is unsustainable. The location of industry, the specifics of state spending on its infrastructure, and access to prestigious positions in all aspects of social life were subjects of struggle among national and ethnic groups. The struggle not only left mounting legacies of resentment and anger, which are surfacing now, they also offer testimony to the effective power such groups wielded throughout the history of all communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The point is that social theories built upon the distribution of power in society as its essential determining element confront a serious difficulty at the outset, namely the precise determination of how social power is distributed. There is considerable evidence in the works cited above that discourses on state capitalism and much else in the USSR have largely avoided this difficulty only by presuming simplistic and inadequate notions of how power was actually distributed there. One close observer of the USSR's political history recently noted the consequences of such notions when faced with the reforms forced in part by its shifting patterns of power distribution. Quote, Sovietologists who denied for decades that change was possible in the system now lack useful concepts for even defining the success or failure of such reforms. End quote. Cohen, 1992. A second weakness closely linked to the first concerns the very meaning of the term power. As Stephen Lukes has shown an examination of the classic definitions by authors ranging widely from Max Weber, Bertrand Russell, Hannah Arendt to Talcott Parsons, Nikos Palantzis, and Michel Foucault, yields fundamental and contradictory differences among their diverse meanings. Not the least of the problem in using the term power is its usually indistinguishable proximity to, quote, influence. Thus, if human relationships in general are conceived, defined, to include complex patterns of interpersonal influences, and have interpersonally effective powers, it makes no sense to identify any relationship in terms of an absence of powers on one side or the other. Rather, all sides of any relationship both exercise and have exercised over them a qualitatively diverse set of kinds of power. What matters are the particular patterns of who exercises what kinds of powers over whom and towards what ends. Footnote. Perhaps the most famous example of this notion of relationships and their constant patterns of interdependent powers Perhaps the most famous example of this notion of relationships and relationships' constituent patterns of interdependent powers wielded is found in Hegel's discussion of lordship and bondage. That discussion pinpoints and logically grounds a perspective fundamentally opposed to those deployed in most discussions of state capitalism. From Hegel's position, any notion according to which power is wielded from only one side, unidirectionally, within a relationship must be rejected. End footnote. Where am I? Where's the footnote? An example relevant to the discussion of state capitalism in the USSR may illustrate the definitional ambiguities intrinsic to power theories and the weakness they inject into the discussion of state capitalism in the USSR. Many journalistic and scholarly critiques of the Soviet centralized planning economy, of Soviet centralized economic planning and administration focus on the power of the center. The planning and management centers are asserted to, quote, possess all the power, end quote, while the workers and local managers lack power. This critique then finds many of the problems and failures of Soviet economic performance to be effects of this power situation. The solution to those problems lies in decentralizing power. However, given the basic problems and contradictions in the received wisdom of what power is, one might equally reasonably suppose that workers and local managers always have power of various kinds in the sense of influences over the power of events in production, however different in different social structures of production. From this standpoint, a critique that begins by asserting a flat absence of power loses much of its sense and its punch. The question becomes instead, what local powers, influences, exist at various moments in the USSR's history, and how do they interact with the patterns of belief, surplus labor performance, and so on, to shape the society's economic performance and much else besides. The example may be pushed one step further. Suppose that workers were given all the self-managing powers proposed, say, in Vanek's careful work. Under one quite plausible set of ideological conditions, such workers might well choose to elect a board of directors who would operate the enterprise in ways virtually identical with the norms of a contemporary capitalist enterprise, in Western Europe. They would consider this elective procedure and arrangement an example of self-management, an effect of their power as they understand the term. Under alternative ideological conditions, the workers might insist on a variation of the above that regularly rotated individuals through the positions of directors and workers. Under still other conditions, the workers might insist that fellow citizens of their localities who are neither workers nor managers sit on such a board of directors. Under still other conditions, the board of directors might itself be banished in favor of weekly or monthly meetings of the workers, and perhaps others, who would then decide specific questions of management and so on. Needless to add, there are countless more possible arrangements that could fall under the heading of workers' self-management. One second. Then, too, there's the issue of just exactly which questions the self-managing workers will address, since they can no more address the infinity of all aspects of production than any conventional capitalist or any other kind of management ever could. The power that self-managing workers wield depends on the objects they wish or think appropriate to manage. For example, workers may focus exclusively upon the questions of which products to produce and how technically to produce them. They may not think in terms of surplus labor and thus not consider how their surplus labor will be appropriated, in what class form, to use the Marxian language, In this case, workers' self-management may yield a variant of conventional capitalist enterprises where the board of directors is elected by workers rather than shareholders, a situation not far removed from arrangements in Western capitalist societies where workers' pension funds are invested in the common stocks of the workers' employer. This raises exactly the same sort of questions about whether and how workers' self-management may change class processes that we encountered above in questioning the significance of replacing private with state property in means of production. These varied questions and possibilities indicate the enormous problems for any power theory of state capitalism that flow from the multiple and contradictory meanings of the term power. These problems become weaknesses of power theory when, as has usually been the case, power theorists refuse to admit and to justify their selection of one as against the other possible concepts of power and its social distribution. The questions and possibilities we have raised also indicate the limits of power analysis. Granting the importance of the distribution of power in society, neither requires nor implies that altered distributions will necessarily have this or that particular social consequence. The latter always depends not only on power, but on all the other aspects of the social context within which the change in a power distribution occurs. In discussions of state capitalism in the USSR, this limitation on power analysis was often, indeed usually, lost sight of. The USSR's class structure, economic performance, cultural activity, and much else were reduced to effects of power. Power became the major or even the exclusive focus of analysis. Other powers among the myriad aspects of a social totality interacting to generate its development over time were pushed to the edges of or made invisible to that analysis. Important perspectives on Soviet state capitalism and on Soviet development generally were thus missed altogether. Conclusion: a surplus labor analysis of state capitalism. One Such missed approach, which we can only sketch here, focuses attention on class processes in the USSR, understood not as matters of the distribution of power, but rather as a matter of the organization of surplus labor. Footnote. The analytical basis for this notion of class processes may be found in our knowledge in class. While our focus is on class in this sense, our approach argues neither that power determines class nor vice versa. Rather, class and power processes interact and interdepend. Parenthesis, we use the term, quote, overdetermine, end quote, for this relationship, end parenthesis. Social analysis must then respect their differences as component processes of the social whole and chart their mutual determinations. We have no need or desire to miss power processes as the power theorists have missed the class processes of surplus labor. End footnote. The point is to build upon Marx and Engels' original focus on exploitation. This approach has the virtue of focusing attention where others have not yet done, on the existing forms of the production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus labor in the USSR across its history. Several other writers have recognized this absence and underscored its importance, without, however, yet filling it with an analysis. We quote Hindus above on, quote, the absence of rigorous definition of the socialist mode of production of surplus labor, end quote. Bettelheim speaks of the importance of, quote, analyzing the production relations, end quote, of, quote, the immediate process of production, end quote, but then organizes analysis around the headings of, quote, forms of management, discipline, cooperation, and organization of labor, end quote. This is, again, Bettelheim's power theoretic approach. Bettelheim omits attention to the class processes, the forms in which surplus labor is produced, parenthesis, by whom and how, in parenthesis, immediately received, parenthesis, by whom and how, in parenthesis, and distributed, parenthesis, by whom, to whom, and how, in parenthesis. Koran and Mogilevsky focus their attention on the distribution of the surplus product, parenthesis, the fruit of the workers' surplus labor, end parenthesis. However, they immediately exhibit their power theoretic approach by 1. Not asking about the organization/form of the production and appropriation of that surplus, parenthesis, before it can be distributed, end parenthesis. 2. Centering their analysis on who, quote, controls the size and distribution of the surplus product. What eludes even those Marxist formulations that recognize the importance of surplus labor is the decision, in terms of an analytic strategy, to investigate the precise forms in which surplus labor was and is produced, appropriated, and distributed in the USSR. This decision recognizes that to appropriate a surplus is different from the power to decide that surplus's size or how it is to be distributed socially. In a state capitalist enterprise, for example, a ministry may appropriate the product of its workers' surplus value labor, while the decision over its size and distribution will be contested, say, among the ministry officials, other state officials, party officials, union officials, and factory committees. The process of appropriating surplus will influence as well as be influenced by the power processes of deciding on its size and distribution, but the class and power processes are not identical, nor is either reducible to or the determinate cause of the other. It says the in italics, determinate cause of the other. Both distinct processes are caught up in the web of all interacting social processes. To make the point as starkly as possible, Marx's suggestion about a communist class structure stress that it would eliminate exploitation because the workers who produce surplus labor, parenthesis, labor beyond that needed to secure their own levels of consumption, in parenthesis, would also appropriate that surplus themselves rather than other persons appropriate it. Footnote. For a detailed discussion of a communist class structure, see Resnick and Wolff, 1988. End footnote. Had such a communist class structure been established in the USSR's state-industrial enterprise, there would still have been struggles among different groups over the power to decide upon the size and distribution of that communist surplus. The point is that precisely because the surplus is communist rather than capitalist, everything in the society has changed, including the powers wielded by the diverse groupings concerned with the size and distribution of the surplus. However, for various reasons, communist class structures were never instituted in Soviet state-industrial enterprises. Footnote: a historical analysis of both the communist and state-capitalist class structures that developed in the USSR in 1917 is contained in several chapters of our forthcoming book. End footnote. While workers directly, as well as Communist Party personnel and state officials, struggle almost continuously over the power to determine the size and distribution of surplus labor, they did not struggle over the capitalist form of the surplus labor itself. In Marxist terms, they did not struggle over the capitalist form of the class structure. In effect, they accepted exploitation, the reality that the producers of the surplus were not its appropriators and that state ministries were. Of course, they did not do this explicitly, since they focused their attention on matters of power, who controlled the means and process of production, and the state apparatus, and since they agreed that private capitalists controlled none of these, they believed that what they had established was socialism as the antithesis of capitalism. Unlike Marx, who focused his analysis on the specifics of the social organization of surplus labor, they focused their analysis on the distribution of power. With relatively few exceptions, they accepted as necessary and inevitable the class structures of state-industrial enterprises. They accepted them because they did not see them. Like the power theorists whose formulations we discussed above, Soviet thinking and writing focused on power, not surplus labor, because a communist party-controlled state displaced private capitalists from power, including power over property, socialism was achieved. From that perspective, the communist states' industrial enterprises were thus socialist, whereas from the perspective of how surplus labor was appropriated, they were state capitalist. The concept of state capitalism, based on Marx's original conception, as applied to the USSR's state-industrial enterprises, yields a different understanding of its past and present from that produced by the power theories of state capitalism. For example, it suggests that the 20th century history of the USSR turns on oscillations between private and state capitalism rather than any general engagement with communist class structures. It suggests that struggles for decentralized and democratic power redistributions, if not connected to struggles for communist rather than capitalist class structures, may contribute to little more than a return to private from state capitalism. It suggests that a theoretical and practical fetishism of power has obscured, for Marxist and revolutionaries, both critics and defenders of the USSR, Marx's determination to add the revolutionary reorganization of surplus labor to the agenda of social change. All right, that's the end of the piece. I'm gonna look up some things. There's resources here. There's a list of references here, and I'm gonna look them up. So if you want to, you can exit out of this and listen no more. But you could also listen, and maybe we'll learn about some cool books. The first one that I don't recognize is Ball, Russia's Last Capitalist. Wikipedia says, not Wikipedia, the description of this book says from University of California Press says, Russia's Last Capitalist, The Netman, 1921 to 1929, by Alan M. Ball. The description of it says, In 1921, Lenin surprised foreign observers and many in his own party by calling for the legalization of private trade and manufacturing. Within a matter of months, this new economic policy spawned many thousands of private entrepreneurs dubbed Netmen. After delineating this political background, Alan Balt turns his attention to the Netmen themselves, examining where they came from, how they fared in competition with the socialist sector of the economy, their importance in the Soviet economy, and the consequences of their, quote, liquidation at the end of the 1920s. Alan Ball's history of this experiment with capitalism is strikingly relevant to current efforts towards economic reform in the USSR. Again, that book's from 1990. Bunch of books from Bedelheim, but I'm familiar with all of them. Bottomore and Good, Austro-Marxism. I don't really see any good descriptions of this book. Marius Brinton, Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, which is on this channel. Bukharin and Preobrazhensky, The ABC of Communism. Burbank, Intelligentsia and Revolution, Russian Views of Bolshevism, 1917 to 1922. Let's see if there's anything for that. Burbank, Intelligentsia and Revolution. Okay. Intelligentsia and Revolution, Russian Views of Bolshevism, 1917 to 1922, by Jane Burbank. The description says, over the 5 years following the Russian Revolution of 1917, there occurred a brilliant outburst of theory and criticism among Russian intellectuals struggling to comprehend their country's vast social upheaval. Much of their intense speculation focused on issues that are still hotly debated. What was this socialism? Why had the revolution happened in Russia? What did Bolshevik power mean for Russia and the Western world? This compelling study recovers these early responses to 1917 and analyzes the specific ideological context out of which they emerge. Jane Burbank explores the ideas and experiences of diverse prominent intellectuals, ranging from the monarchists on the right to the Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and anarchists on the left, following these thinkers through the turbulent years of civil war and rebuilding of state power. Burbank shows how revolution both revitalized the political culture and exposed the fragile base of its existence. That's interesting. Chase, W.J. Chase, 1987, Workers' Society in the Soviet State, Labor and Life in Moscow. I don't see any good descriptions of that. An article by V.G. Child from 1950 titled The Urban Revolution, and a piece by V.G. Child from 1952 titled The Birth of Civilization. Tony Cliff, State Capitalism in Russia. Stephen F. Cohen, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution. Rethinking the Soviet Experience, and an article what's really happening in Russia. I've already known about the Bukharin book. So I'm going to look up the Rethinking the Soviet Experience. This is published with Oxford University Press. Rethinking the Soviet Rethinking the Soviet Experience, Politics and History Since 1917 by Stephen F. Cohen. The description says, this wide-ranging volume cuts through Cold War stereotypes of the Soviet Union to arrive at fresh interpretations of that country's traumatic history and its present-day political realities. Replacing simplistic explanations of Soviet development, Cohen challenges the popular view of the USSR as a totalitarian monolith and examines the possibilities for change that exist within the Soviet system today. Back to the text. Sorry, one second. I'm looking up this book. Socialist Construction and Marxist Theory, Bolshevism and Its Critique. I don't see any descriptions of it. Maurice Daub, Soviet Economic Development Since 1917. This book follows on from the author's volume Russian Economic Development, and although it encompasses some of the same material, it charts the history and progress of the Soviet economy down to the efforts at reconstruction after the Second World War. A new chapter was added which covers the post-war decade from the end of the war to the announcement of the sixth-year plan. I don't know if that's supposed to say sixth five-year plan or not. Dostoevskaya, Marxism and Freedom, we all know that. Engels, Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, we all know that. We all know Anti-During. Fine and Harris, 1979, Rereading Capital. I don't really see a good description for this book. Fitzpatrick, Cultural Revolution in Russia. The description for this book, which is published by Indiana University Press, says, China's Cultural Revolution of the 1960s had an important precedent in the Soviet Union during the first five-year plan, when established authorities and institutions in culture and the professions came under attack from militant communist intellectuals. One of the most challenging questions for the students of this turbulent era is the actual nature of the revolution. Was it, quote, revolution from above, initiating control by the party leadership, or, quote, revolution from below, brought on by Marxist radicals within the cultural professions and pressure from an upwardly mobile working class? This important book, focused on the transition from the new economic policy to Stalinism, presents both sides of the vigorous current debate. And it looks like this is an edited volume that has pieces by Katerina Clark, George M. Entine, Sheila Fitzpatrick, Jerry F. Hugh, David Jurovsky, Gail Warshawski, Lapidus, Moshe Lewin, Robert S. Charlotte, Susan Gross Solomon, and S. Frederick Starr. Back to the text. An article by an S. Gabriel from 1990. Ancients, A Marxian Theory of Exploitation, published in Rethinking Marxism. Hegel, Phenomenology of Mind. Hilferding, State Capitalism or Totalitarian State Economy. Hindis and Hurst, Pre-Capitalist Modes of Production. The description of this book says, first published in 1975, this book investigates the various pre-capitalist modes of production briefly indicated in the works of Marx and Engels and gives an examination of the conditions of the transition from one mode of production to another. The fundamental concepts used in these investigations, including those of mode of production, of necessary labor and surplus labor, of politics and state, are derived from Capital and from other works of Marxist theory. The primary aim of the analysis is to raise the conceptualization of pre-capitalist modes of production and of transition to a more rigorous level. This book will appear controversial to both Marxists and non-Marxists alike. And its table of contents are 1. Primitive communism, politics and state. 2. Ancient mode of production. 3. Slavery. 4. The, quote, Asiatic mode of production. 5. The feudal mode of production. 6. The transition from feudalism to capitalism. Back to the text. Hobsbawm, Introduction to Karl Marx, Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations. Horkheimer, The Authoritarian State. C.L.R. James, State Capitalism and World Revolution, which is on this channel. Martin J., The Dialectical Imagination, which you all know that's a history. The Frankfurt School. W. Jerome and Adam Buick, 1967, Soviet State Capitalism, History of an Idea. One second, I want to look something up real quick. Sorry, I was just trying to see if I could find this book. So I'm trying to find that article. I can't. Anyway, Bob Jessup, 1982, The Capitalist State. B. Kaminsky, 1991, The Collapse of State Socialism. The Collapse of State Socialism, The Case of Poland by Bartolomei Kaminsky. The description says, does the abrupt collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe arise only from errors in implementing the policy of state socialism, leaving the concept itself still a potentially valid one? Bartolomei Kaminsky argues to the contrary. State socialism is a fundamentally defective idea that was well carried out, enabling it to exist until its accumulated shortcomings made its survival extremely difficult. How did the flawed state socialist system endure for so long? Why is it failing now? In answering these questions, Kaminsky, who is both an economist and a political analyst, proposes a general theory and then applies it to the case of Poland, contending that the breakdown of state socialism results from symbiosis of the state and the economy. The book describes how communist governments searched for tools that would replace the market mechanism and the rule of law. Doomed to advance by the absence of autonomy and competition, this search generated new crises by undermining the state's capacity to suppress individual interest and to direct the economy. Originally published in 1991. Let's keep going. Kautsky, The Class Struggle or Erfurt Program. H. Kuromiya, Stalin's Industrial Revolution. Trying to find a description of this book. It says, this is the first detailed political and social history in English of Stalin's Industrial Revolution during the first 5-year plan. The diversion of vast resources into industrialization severely squeezed national consumption, imposing a heavy burden and sacrifice on the entire nation. Back to the text. Jacek Kuran and I can't remember the names. Kuran and Mogilevsky. Open letter to party members. Lenin, The Threatening Catastrophe and How to Fight It. Collected works. Blah, blah, blah. Stephen Looks, Power, A Radical View. The description of this book, which is from when? I don't know. Stephen Luke's Power, A Radical View is a seminal work still widely used some 30 years after publication. The second edition includes the complete original text alongside 2 major new essays. One assesses the main debates about how to conceptualize and study power, including the influential contributions of Michel Foucault. The other considers Stephen Luke's own views in light of these debates and of criticisms of his original argument. With a new introduction and bibliographical essay, this book will consolidate its reputation as a classic work and a major reference point within social and political theory. Back to the text. Marx Capital, Volume 2 and 3, and the Civil War in France. Paul Maddock, Marx and Keynes, The Limits of Mixed Economy. Friedrich Pollock, State Capitalism, Its Possibilities and Limitations. Resnick and Wolff, What Are Class Analyses, published in Research in Political Economy, Volume 9. The book, 1987. Knowledge and Class. See if I can find a description of this book. Not really seeing any good descriptions of it, honestly. It says intense debates in recent decades have provoked major new directions in Marxist theory. Earlier reductionist notions of knowledge, dialectics, contradiction, class, and capitalism have been challenged and profoundly transformed. Back to the text. Rizzi, Bureaucratization of the World. E.R. Service, Origins of State and Civilization. The description for this book says, how did civilized life begin? How did civilized life begin? How did government arise? These questions have intrigued philosophers and historians since ancient times. In this volume, Elman R. Service, an anthropologist widely known for his studies of evolution and social organization, uses a unique mix of ethnology, history, and archaeology in exploring the origins and early development of political organization. In Part 1, titled Origins of Government, Service outlines the basic patterns of power and authority that structure even the most primitive societies, showing how these patterns become elaborated as simple egalitarian societies evolve into more complex hierarchical forms. He also discusses classical theories of government from the Enlightenment through Marx and Engels to modern social scientists. Part 2, titled Modern Primitive States, illustrates the development of institutionalized government. Among the societies discussed are the Zulu and the Ashanti in Africa, the Cherokee in North America, and Hawaii in Oceania. Part 3, titled Archaic Civilizations, looks at the 6 primary ancient civilizations in Mesoamerica, Peru, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus River Valley, and China, in light of the historical and ethnographical data. We should not expect to find, Service argues, that primitive cultures mirror the basic structures of modern society. In particular, Service takes a critical look at the theory that the state, defined by the presence of repressive, legal, formal, social controls based on physical force, is a necessary element in the development of civilization. Back to the text. J.G. Taylor, From Modernization to Modes of Production. Yeah, I'm not really seeing any descriptions of this. Moving on. Trotsky, Terrorism and Communism. And the Revolution Betrayed. J. Vanek, Self-Management, Economic Liberation of Man. Not really seeing any descriptions of this either. Lynn Viola, 1987, Best Sons of the Fatherland, Workers in the Vanguard of Soviet Collectivization. The description of this says, here Lynn Viola, the first Western scholar to gain access to the Soviet state archives on collectivization, brilliantly examines a lost chapter in the history of the Stalin Revolution. Looking in detail at the backgrounds, motivations, and mentalities of the 25,000ers, Viola embarks on the first Western investigation of the everyday activities of Stalin's rank-and-file shock troops, the, quote, leading cadres of socialist construction. In the process, Viola sheds new light on how the state mobilized working-class support for collectivization and reveals that, contrary to popular belief, the 25,000ers went into the countryside as willing recruits. This unique social history uses a, quote, on-the-scene, end quote, line of vision to offer a new understanding of the workings, times, and cadres of Stalin's revolution. Okay, so that's the end. Thanks for listening.